All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hey all, Jody here. A quick reminder that we are running some of our favorite episodes during this holiday break. So here is part 2 of the special we did last year on the history of the war on Christmas. It still holds up. A lot of you have reached out to say that you missed it last year or you're new listeners to the show. So that's great. If you hear any dated references or references to it being 2020, that is why. I was going to edit those references out, but honestly, I'm not totally convinced that it's not still 2020. So anyway, here's the episode. Hope you enjoy and stay safe out there. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And this is part 2 of our 2-part special on the war on Christmas. Last episode, we talked about the twists and turns in recent years, starting with Bill O'Reilly in 2004. So that was 2004 to 2020. And now we will do everything before 2004 in one episode. So I don't know. Do we want to hook it to a date? Let's say December 25th, 336 AD, which many religious scholars point to as the first date that Christmas was celebrated. Nikki, are we going to go that far back in time?
Look, I think that you can put the chit down on 336 AD and we can move forward in time pretty quickly.
Fair enough.
And was Santa white at that time? I need to know.
Exactly. An important question. Those voices are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Merry War on Christmas, Jody.
Yes, and Michael Hobbes is back, host of the excellent podcast You're Wrong About and Maintenance Phase, and noted expert on religious customs during the reign of Roman Emperor Constantine. So I know you have a lot to say about 336 AD.
I'm wearing a toga right now, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go back in time. Nikki, how far back? Where do you want to start here?
I want to start with the Puritans, because I feel like if we're going to go back to the War on Christmas, we'll keep it just to the U.S. And the War on Christmas was basically how the American colonies were founded in a lot of ways. The Puritans were not big fans of Christmas. They thought that it was too pagan. They thought that it was too debauched, that people were using it to drink and indulge in other vices. And so they would do things like go work on Christmas Day just to make the point that they weren't celebrating, that this was actually just a regular day. We're not doing anything differently. We're going to go to work. And then you have, like, by the mid 1600s, Boston outlaws Christmas. They just outlaw any celebration of the holiday because, again, they see it as too much of a pagan ritual, too much of, not true enough to their religion. So they just X the whole thing out.
So this is a war on Christmas from the other direction, from the more religious side of the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. It was Christians against Christmas.
Yes.
It's always interesting to me, actually, that the War on Christmas people aren't more annoyed about like the commodification of Christmas and the Coca-Cola-ization of Christmas. Because I grew up in a very Christian household, and my parents were frustrated by the fact that it had become this secular thing. Like, they wanted it to be more religious. They went out of their way to have like religious references in the Christmases that we had. And they were like annoyed at the fact that it was in all these malls and that it was like trees and Santa and these secular symbols. And it's always interesting to me that sort of Starbucks like became the enemy in the War on Christmas, but not in like the way that it should have been. It's weird.
Sure.
The story of Christmas in the United States is the story of embracing the secularism of the holiday.
Yeah, I mean, that's so fascinating. You know, we hinted at it a little bit last episode, but yeah, you see that when you look at this longer history of how it's swirling between what role does religion actually play in all of this, and a lot of the defenses of Christmas, the modern defenses of Christmas, are actually defending it as a secular holiday. There isn't that much religiosity in it, but it sort of has the trappings of feeling like a religious war, when actually I think it's more of a cultural war. That said, Nikki, I mean, when you look at some of the stuff in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and you can bring up some of the other incidents, it does feel like, as shallow as the modern War on Christmas is, this feels like it's actually hinting at some like big, deep conversation about how religious of a country is this new nation going to be?
It's absolutely about that. And that's why this is so important, because there was a real struggle because people wanted to celebrate Christmas. They loved that it was this like kind of drunken, debauched holiday, that it had all of these traditions. And it was this kind of scolding Christians who didn't want people to celebrate that way. They felt like that people were celebrating it wrong and that it was an entryway to all of these other kind of pagan traditions. I mean, this is something that you actually see in this moment in 1826 up at the West Point. The campus itself was a dry campus, but the idea that you had to have alcohol and you had to have debauchery to properly celebrate Christmas led all of these cadets to smuggle whiskey and bourbon onto campus, spike the eggnog, and it leads to something called the eggnog riot because of all of the escapades they got up to once they got wasted on whiskey.
I thought that was just what happened at the kids' table every Christmas.
Yes, exactly. It is a great little story, the eggnog riot of, 1826. I was up at West Point just driving through recently, and I like pulled out my phone and said, I wonder if there's some podcast episodes about West Point. I don't know that much about it. And I ended up listening to a bunch of stuff about the eggnog riot, and it is sort of fascinating. And again, yeah, it did get to these questions about religion, but then in this case also kind of like the U.S. military was starting to push in more sort of standardized directions and really wanted to close ranks, and this felt like the last hurrah for a bunch of people who just wanted to like be debaucherous and get into a bunch of trouble between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And also just the history of egg-based drinks
Yikes.
is just very icky.
Yeah.
Like, especially when we don't have good refrigeration.
Yeah,
like
before electricity? Yeah.
Yeah, they were those. It was, you don't want to think about that too much.
Can I ask, was it a family holiday at that time? Because the combination of debauchery and family is interesting to me.
So this is actually a really interesting story because Christmas had been very much a public holiday. And that was what really bothered people so much, because people would be out in the streets and they would be partying and they would be drunk and engaging in all of these vices. And so one of the ways that they sought to temper that was not just to outlaw the holiday, which, you know, they brought it back by the mid 17th century, but to begin to pitch it as a family holiday. So you know that Christmas poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas"? Mm-hmm. That was all part of this idea of presenting Christmas as a home-based holiday, one that's centered on hearth and family, so that people would celebrate at home rather than out in public.
Oh.
Interesting.
So it's kind of a story of like cultural appropriation in some ways. It's like the transformation of this holiday.
Everything is being appropriated in this holiday.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll get into, Christmas trees and Yule logs and all of these things. But obviously, like all of these traditions that we now associate very closely with Christmas were themselves appropriated.
In the sort of first half and the middle of the 19th century, Christmas does start to become a actual official holiday. And, you know, one interesting thing is that I think Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas were the first states to declare them holidays, and that was in 1830s, 1840s, and then it wasn't until 1870 that it becomes a federal holiday. But even then, Nikki, you get this sense of, I don't think it's a coincidence. It's 3 states in the South that are declaring this, and so I think you start to see those cultural and religious lines emerge even way back then.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the reason why you have that split is because, remember, I think we might have talked about this when we were talking about Thanksgiving. In the South, there was a real resistance to celebrating Thanksgiving because it was seen as this Yankee holiday that was being injected into Southern culture. And so in the South, they preferred to focus all of their attention on Christmas.
Culture war, early culture war. These libs and their Thanksgiving.
America's always been a culture war.
Yeah.
Has anyone written a God? This is why I'm not a historian. Has anyone written a story of the Civil War as from a purely culture war lens?
Ooh, wedge issue. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's implicit in so much of the writing about the Civil War. But I would imagine that would only be in more recent works. A lot of the early ones like to focus on pincher maneuvers and battles and things like that.
Let's see. So, another interesting thing here. I mean, it is really the 1830s to the 1870s where this starts to look like the modern landscape that it is now. Because another thing that happens is in the 1860s, the phrase "Happy Holidays" starts to come into place. And so, as this becomes a formalized holiday, and then you have Thanksgiving, you already start to get people saying, "Well, let's think of this as a secularized season as opposed to this one specific contested religious holiday."
Yeah, and that makes sense because who's going to be saying Merry Christmas in early December? And yet it's already the season, right? Especially having Thanksgiving in late November, Christmas in late December, as the celebration of Christmas spreads, it becomes a holiday season. And part of that is rooted in religious practice. Christians and Catholics celebrate Advent, which are those 4 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. And then that even gets secularized into the Advent calendar, which has a slightly different start date than the liturgical Advent, because one of them is very much based in a church, and one of them is based on the fact that you want to reuse your Advent calendar, and it needs to have the same number of days every year. And the length of Advent is always changing. But that idea that you're marking a season, that it's a season of anticipation, it has religious roots, but it very quickly becomes this secular celebration. And instead of saying Happy Advent, we all say Happy Holidays.
This is my beef with Christmas. I think they should move it to the summer months because... I'm seeing my family in late November. I got to see them again in late December. That's too much family. Move it to May.
Oh, I so strongly disagree. I feel like you need just a string of holidays to make it through the days when the sun sets at 4:30.
They should just invent one at the end of every month for January, February, and March. That's the ticket.
I'm probably partway between the two of you in that I think one of the sort of key moments in my life was when I started to just think of those holidays as not both equal obligations, but Thanksgiving is for this and Christmas is for this. And we see this family on Thanksgiving and this family on Christmas. And now it just unburdens you a little bit. You get to enjoy both of them. But yes, I agree, Michael. Sometimes it can be a real grind to just be in it.
We should go back to eggnog rioting.
Yeah, exactly. I will say also this, since we're talking about happy holidays, I think you said this last episode, Michael, but it's just easier to just start saying Happy Holidays in early November and then do it till after New Year's, and it just works. And you don't have to,
yes.
Anything that makes your life, you have to think, 2% less. I'm all on board with that. And to not think about who you're talking to or what date it is, or just say Happy Holidays.
Or it's saying hello instead of good morning, good afternoon. I don't want to look at my watch before I do that every time. Just make it. Let's all agree it's hello.
Yeah, exactly. Nikki, we've been talking about this through the lens of the United States, of course, but a lot of these are traditions, as you've been hinting at, that are brought to this country by immigrants, colonizers, and then immigrants throughout the centuries. So there's always this mix of traditions that's playing into the way that Christmas has evolved and the tensions around Christmas in this country.
Well, it's because, I mentioned the Advent calendar, which is something that was imported from Germany, but actually all of the good Christmas traditions come from their Germanic countries. They get picked up in England in the mid-19th century, and then they get shipped over to the United States, and they also come through German immigrants. But everything from putting up a tree in your house that you then decorate with lots of ornaments and lights, that comes from Germany. The Advent calendar comes from Germany. A lot of the gingerbread, or Lebkuchen as they call it, as a Christmas celebratory biscuit, comes in many ways from Germany. And so like all of these amazing traditions come through both German immigrants and then the fact that Queen Victoria was married to a German man. And so she's the one who really spreads the practice and celebration of Christmas across Britain and the colonies. And the fact that she was married to a German man, I think, is why we have all of these kind of amazing traditions. So I just wanted to shout out the Germanic countries who did this thing right.
Dude, I lived in Denmark and Germany for 11 years, and Christmas is lit.
It's nuts, right?
You like hold hands around the tree with your whole family, and you sing songs together for like literal hours.
Like the Who's down
just
in
you
Whoville.
and your family. It's great. Yes.
That's awesome.
I think we should take the whole package and bring it over here.
Totally agree. And the Christmas markets, it's lovely.
Yeah, Glühwein. Bring it.
The thing I learned just in this taping just now is, I have to confess that for me, advent calendars have always been like cheap paper calendars that you get a new one every year and you open it up and you're surprised by what's behind it. And I am now learning that an advent calendar is actually maybe a little more substantive, and you reuse it every year, which seems to me like the whole point of the advent calendar for me is like the little surprise of what's going to be behind the little door. If you're reusing it, that you know what's coming.
Yeah, so they used to be made out of wood, and they would have little drawers or little doors, and you would stick like Bible verses behind them, or sometimes if you had enough money, you could stick little treats in them, but there weren't that many rich people. And so it sort of developed that way. I mean, yes, now we have let's say the cardboard knockoffs, but those actually, I should say, since we're on the subject of advent calendars, those don't really become popular in the United States until the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower is photographed with his grandchildren playing with an advent calendar. He was our first German-American president.
There you go.
So it's no surprise there. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think we should go to the 50s here. So we have, Happy Holidays in the 20s and 30s. And then Dwight Eisenhower, his cards that he would send out always had season's greetings. And I don't know if he got a little flack there. But but definitely in the 50s is where I think you start to see, let's see, what are the forces? We have religion, we have culture war. But now we start to see, I think, the Cold War get layered into this conversation as well. Right, Nikki?
Yeah, commies. I mean, you start to see this idea that the Cold War is not just about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, not just communism versus democracy, but religion versus atheism. That's a huge line for anti-communists in the United States, is that when the Reds come, they're going to take your church away from you. And so there is this war on Christmas narrative that comes about that's actually rooted in something real. I mean, the Soviets did purge religion from Christmas. Sure. They would put up these trees still, but they would put a big red star on top of them and call them like a New Year's tree. But yeah, so you have like the John Birch Society in 1959 asking, is Christ being driven out of Christmas to soften us for communism?
Good question. I'd buy that pamphlet.
I love the headlines where it's just something extremely incendiary and then a question mark. It's like, no, it's okay. Right. I put a question mark at the end of it.
Good journalistic practice.
Yeah.
And this is, we did an episode about this, but this is also the period in which we have In God We Trust comes back into the mix. And that, of course, had a lot to do with the Cold War and fears of not just a loss of religion, but an imposition by our political enemies of secularism. And you start to see pushback throughout the country. In 1954, the Waterloo, Iowa Chamber of Commerce kind of went to the front lines of the war on Christmas and declared that they were going to put Christ back in Christmas with their decorations, and they put up a huge manger scene and so forth. So, it starts to bubble up. I'm sure this dips into schools as well. Like when you read about this stuff, a lot of the moral panics are from parents who say, oh gosh, I went to my kid's pageant and there were no religious songs anymore. It was all secular songs at the holiday pageant. Those are the better songs anyway.
They are the better songs. That's a lot of times because they're a lot older, and they weren't written as like cola jingles, which many of our Christmas songs are.
Yeah. I feel like so much of our modern world has been created out of this desire to draw a contrast between us and the Soviets. And like we've completely forgotten the reasons for all of this, but it's like all of this stuff is just totally made up. We just made up all of this. Like In God We Trust is a good example. That we make it up, we put it into schools, and it's like, it's always been this way. Like, well, no, it objectively hasn't. We did it for a very specific reason, but we immediately forgot the reason as soon as we did it.
I know. It turns out the reason for the season is to defeat the communists.
Yes. Also, Season's Greetings is good, too. I'm cool with Season's Greetings. That one's like even
Season's
less.
Greetings is great.
Yeah, it's like you don't even have holidays in there.
Yeah, and that's been around for a long time as well. I mean, Season's Greetings is a greeting that goes back to the sort of last third of the 19th century.
Man,
Yeah.
let's all do that.
There's a lot of other options out there.
Like I said, we've always been at war with Christmas.
Yes. So let's start to wrap up a little bit here. But I mean, when we did our episode about Thanksgiving, one of the things I learned that was really fascinating there was when Roosevelt tried to move Thanksgiving, it was because he wanted to extend the Christmas shopping season. And it was a reminder that this notion of the holiday season and these religious holidays being tied to commercialism has always been there. That said, I do think like that becomes a bigger concern in the latter half of the 20th century. So how does that filter into all of this, Nikki? How does, if we've now got fears of communism and we've got a religious war and we've got some geographic differences, now all of a sudden we have commercialism filtering in, how does that bring us up towards the present?
Yeah, the commercialism angle is really interesting, right? Because it's actually the sort of center moral of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, right? This fear that Christmas was becoming too commercialized. And so that critique of the commercialism of Christmas is already embedded in our Christmas traditions. You see it in all of these stories that are focused on finding the true reason for the season. But what's interesting is that those critiques of commercialism are muted because they don't cleave cleanly to our political lines.
Yeah.
There's not a neat package for it. And so it largely drops out of the War on Christmas when the War on Christmas becomes a more political event.
That's interesting. I mean, that also points to people like Fox News or talk radio hosts or any sort of media person who's trying to whip up fears over some sort of moral panic, that it's just difficult to do that when the thing you're panicking about crosses partisan lines. Because if you wanted to whip up Christian sentiment, there's probably Democratic Christians and Republican Christians. And so that doesn't cleave in like a nice, easy way. But then once you get later, then it's just like everybody, like this evangelical understanding of Christianity and this sort of lib attack on it or whatever, that it is like very easily whipped up by Republicans. So it's
right.
more like a media market story than actual ideology.
Well, and it speaks to a kind of splintering that's happened in the country because even the churches have largely begun to divide along
right.
political lines.
Right.
And so even that deeply embedded religious critique of commercialism is terrible for this holiday. It distracts us from the things that we should be concentrating on. It doesn't get a lot of cross-party or cross-ideology traction.
It's also, I don't know how old you guys are, but do you guys remember when Black Friday was not a thing?
I have a notion of it sort of becoming more and more of a thing.
Yeah.
But there was a point at which it was...
There was a time before it was riots.
Yes.
Well, that's true.
I remember growing up, it was like you kind of were vaguely aware of it, but it wasn't a huge deal. And then over the course of my lifetime, it's become kind of like a de facto holiday or something. It appears in all the newspapers. It's this massive thing. And it just like, it was a weird niche thing when I was growing up. And if you were 10 years older than me, it would probably be totally invisible for most of your life.
The one that I do remember in my lifetime is when it creeped then into even Thanksgiving Day.
Yes.
And when, like big box stores would force workers to come in on Thanksgiving afternoon so that they could open their doors and have that Thursday, sale.
Right.
And it's just like
pre-Black Friday. I know.
One day.
Yeah.
For crying out loud. We should also talk about, we've talked about this as sort of a cultural phenomenon, a media phenomenon. I mean, I do think in the 70s, 80s, 90s, this conversation about religion and the secularization of Christmas does start to also become a proxy conversation for fears about white identity and about cultural diversity in this country and immigration and sort of, all the stuff that we can draw through to right now. So I don't want to just treat this as a sort of media spat or whatever. I mean, there is a through line of America is a white Christian country. And if you lose Merry Christmas, all of a sudden, we're giving over our country to those people.
I really want to draw a bold line underneath that, Jody, because one of the names that keeps popping up when it comes to the history of the modern war on Christmas is Peter Brimlow, who is the founder of VDare, which is a white nationalist website. And he was actually pretty popular and pretty mainstream in the mid-1990s with his attacks on immigration. But the idea that he's one of these progenitors of the idea of the war on Christmas, and that he's so deeply steeped in nativism and whiteness and this defense of the United States as a particular kind of country is, I think, really important to the point that you just made.
I think they should make it illegal for white nationalist groups to have the names of things that sound like cool skateboarding brands. You're like, ooh, V-Dare. Yeah, it seems fine. Seems like something the kids are into, and it's like, oh, shit.
Some of the kids are into it, but...
Yeah. Dang it.
And then I guess we can bring it, let's do it. Let's do this loop all the way back to where we started. So in 2003 and 2004, we have Peggy Noonan and Bill O'Reilly. And I mentioned that Peggy Noonan was writing some columns about this. I did not realize when I mentioned it at the time, and I will mention it now, that she actually pitched this into a sort of 9/11 context. And so she said that the fact that her Virgin Mary statue, that her neighbors on the Upper East Side, it was the Upper East Side, did not like the Virgin Mary statue she'd put out, was proof that, quote, the meaning and actuality of 9/11 has receded. And obviously, if we're talking post 9/11 and religion, there's an element of Islamophobia here. I don't think it's a coincidence that all this pops up post 9/11, although I'm not exactly sure what Peggy Noonan means when she wrote that.
I'm not sure that Noonan does either, but I think that it shows you just how conflated Christianity and nationalism have become in the United States, that, complaining about a statue of the Virgin Mary has something to do with like losing your sense of patriotism and the meaning of America. And that conflation of those two things is key to the war on Christmas.
There's also, this is another thing that you find in sort of moral panicky kind of thought, is you see these broad sweeping statements of like, they're destroying what we are as a nation, but it's not really spelled out what that means or how you would sort of measure the consequences of that. You see this, in the gay marriage debate for years, you saw like, they're destroying marriage. It's like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, how would we measure that taking place? Like, what does it mean to destroy an institution that would then include more people? It's just these like weird, these broad philosophical defenses for things that don't really have any real world component to them.
You said it last episode, and I so agree. Like, I think slippery slope arguments are so, like, the slipperiest slope of all is a slippery slope argument. I just am so skeptical of them generally. And I think, that's what you're getting at here. All right. Well, look, we brought it all the way back to 2004, so let's wrap it up. So, Michael Hobbes, thank you so much for joining us. And you do work at Huffington Post, and then, of course, the excellent podcast You're Wrong About, and Maintenance Phase. Anything else you want to plug? This is your chance.
Just drink some eggnog and have a little riot this Christmas. Flip over some cars, set them on fire. That's what eggnog does to people.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
All right, that's the end of the show, and hopefully you had as much fun as we did doing a little special, breaking format a bit, and doing that two-parter. It is Christmas week. It is New Year's week. It is the holiday season. So the show is still going to come out next Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. But we're going to give ourselves a little bit of a break on our end, and we're going to just run some of our favorite episodes from the year on those days. So you will still get an episode. You'll get a short episode. There is a good chance it's something that maybe you missed. We have a lot of new listeners. So that's the plan for the next little bit. And then we will be back with new episodes in the new year and lots of big plans for 2021. So I say it now. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. All of the above. Thank you so much for listening to this show over the course of the year and supporting us in all sorts of ways. It really does mean a lot. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Get in touch if you have any questions or comments about the show. You can find us at thisdaypod.com. You can also email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. If one of your New Year's resolutions is to leave a rating or review for this podcast, I know it's the time to make big, important resolutions like that. You can do so on your favorite podcast player of choice. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.